So I'm really pleased to have this chance to talk about and think about ghosts and astronauts again. Perhaps the first thing to explain is a slightly unusual way of engaging with the material. I can't make it to the conference in Helsinki, but I really appreciated the chance to present. So this idea of doing some sort of Skype interview video published document seemed to be pretty appropriate, given that Ghosts and Astronauts in 1997 used what might be called very early Skype, See You See Me, which was one of the first internet video streaming that allowed people to communicate through their computers. The second reason why this feels like a very appropriate time to revisit a performance from 18 years ago is that I'm actively involved here at Malmö University and in the Medea studio with a project called Living Archives. And we're pursuing the question and the practices of performing memory. So in a way, what I'm doing now is reactivating, reenacting, and somehow performing the memory of Ghosts and Astronauts that happened 18 years ago. So Ghosts and Astronauts was a philosophical and a physical experimentation. I wanted to enter into a dialogue or a critique with Paul Virilio in his deeply held concern for the loss of the body in telematic and virtual space. The second inspiration for Ghosts and Astronauts was Kitsu Dubois and her choreographic experimentation in zero gravity with the French Aerospace Agency. You may know she was hired by them in the 90s to help to train the astronauts to habituate themselves to movement and functioning in weightlessness. I read an interview from a French conference that was published in Proceedings, and on the basis of her observations, I visited her studio in Paris with Gretchen Schiller. So we also had that conversation with her. So we took some principles from Kitsu's experience into a studio on the Essex Road at the time. And there were 3 instructions that I found particularly interesting. The first one, and these are all from Kitsu's work in zero gravity, her phenomenological observations. The first one was that in order to move at all, you had to push against something when you're in weightlessness. You couldn't just initiate movement. Movement had to be in relation to a force on something external. The second principle that we took into improvisation was that in order to go from one point to another, such as it is in space, you couldn't go in a straight line. You had to spiral. So motion was done through rolling or curving or some aspect of a torque, a spiraling movement. And the second one was an interesting one relating to how the body parts, the limbs, moved in space. It was that arms and legs would move away from the core of the body quite slowly, almost as if you were pressing against a viscous substance, while they would return to the body quickly. And that return to the body initiated in its own a spiraling movement. So we took these principles into the studio, and by we I mean Ruth Gibson, Anne Holst and I, and we devised through improvisation for many hours at a time. The other thing that we did was relied quite heavily on a score by Morton Feldman. And the reason for this is that we knew Jonathan Owen Clark, Johnny Clark, had agreed to write the musical composition for the piece. And his inspiration at the time was a lot of Feldman, in particular the gaps between the sounds. So I'm going to play about 15 seconds of Feldman here. The distinct thing about using this was that we began to pay attention to what we wouldn't normally pay attention to, which is the space between the sounds And that became translated into a strange meditative experience where time and space shifted. We were quite disciplined about rehearsing for very long periods of time without stopping and without talking amongst each other. So we would do an hour long or an hour and a half long improvisation. And throughout that, our engagement with each other and with space became quite, well, altered. It was really an exercise in altered states. In Riverside Studios, we had a long piece of fabric, large scrim, attached at the ceiling and extended outwards on a diagonal to the floor. And Anne and Ruth were suspended in harnesses over the diagonal surface. My image was projected onto that surface. In the place, we were a bit more tied to the proscenium arch. I was on the stage, but we were able to use their cinema screen as a scrim, and we projected Ruth and Anne's image onto the scrim, where I performed behind it. One other thing I will say about the performance is that it's worth remembering how fragile the internet connections were. One of the venues had an early broadband, it had an early ISDN, but the other venue had a dial-up, and I can't remember which was which at the moment. So we lost connections frequently, and there was a lot of buffering that would go on, so that eventually we weren't actually simultaneously dancing with each other. I'm just reflecting on the fact that the Skype connection that we're using right now in 2015 also has a lot of feedback on it. The title, Gravity and Its Sisters, refers to a collection of writings from Sylvan Tompkins that was edited by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Adam Frank. And this is a key text in the exploration of affect that actually came out in 1995, interestingly. My interest in materiality and kinesthetics shifted to an interest in affect and somatics. So my recollection at the moment of Ghosts and Astronauts is inevitably through an affective lens and through increased awareness in somatic engagement. And the thing that's most interesting to me about affect is that it's an exchange of forces. It's not just emotions. And it relies on an understanding of ebbs and flows, of tensions, of qualities that don't necessarily differentiate between the physical and the emotional, and, for example, meteorology, structures, other organic and inorganic exchanges. It's a much more fluid set of relationships between one particular body and qualitative states and exchanges. So when we think of Tompkins' construction of 8 affects, which includes some of the regular ones with an emphasis on shame and anger and joy and excitement, we also can create a parallel with the qualities that come from weightlessness, because weightlessness is a physical state of being, but it's also highly affective. It can tinge the quality of our memories. It can actually create a sense of inner buoyancy or rootlessness, lack of connection, of great possibility, or of despair even. So I have some sisters of gravity, like dropping, falling, rising, floating, sinking, spiraling. Some of these are tied directly to Kitsu Dubois' instructions, but it's really significant that it's filtered through my recollection of the Ghosts and Astronauts process. And I'll say that I remember more the devising process than the actual performance. The performance for me has faded in significance, but the physical experimentation, if anything, has become more powerful. I think it related quite strongly to the series of experiments that Ruth Gibson and I had undertaken, where we were quite deliberate about not wanting to import dance vocabulary or pre-prepared steps or movement into a technological environment. that was when an emphasis on improvisation became very, very, very strong. Instead of just using digital technology of all descriptions, whether it was sensor technology, real-time video, or telematics as a scenography or a backdrop, we wanted to see how it shifted our way of relating to one another. And that involved paying great attention to the visual disintegration and reintegration, the lags, the pixelation, and the quality of movement that was against a backdrop that was often so grainy that it could have been outer space. I'm aware also of the tremendous cultural imaginary we all have of the early spacewalks in the 1960s, of the little spacemen bouncing against this vast universal blackness. And in some respects, the foreground background of telematics invited that sense of the body against the tremendous void. And it had a creepy quality also, a real tenuousness and a vulnerability, which was what I always appreciated also about Kozel Dubois. It was her sense of being open to the strangeness, and letting the questioning enter into her movement practices, despite the fact that she had a very specific task, which was training bodies for specific practical actions. She still had this poetic quality of questioning and engaging with weightlessness and what that means as a body. It's quite a bit more specific. The fascination with telematics began with Paul Sermon's very poetic and simple but compelling setup. But Ghosts and Astronauts, I return again, is different because of the physical and philosophical starting points and the many, many hours we had devising in a studio before we even entered into the telematic hookup. And that was different from telematic dreaming, where there was really no sense of rehearsal. It was just an ongoing engagement, and yeah, we didn't bring a set of conceptual or artistic questions into the room beforehand to the extent that we did with Ghosts and Astronauts. And I'm thinking again about the strange somatic extremity of the piece. Rereading my own writing. It was the last thing I did in my reenactment of memory before going back to my own writing. I listened to the music, I thought about it, I looked at some of the images. But then when I got to the writing, I was reminded again of how nauseous we became, how seasick we became in the studio when we did these experiments for 45, 60, 90 minutes, because we were really unhinging ourselves from our normal sense of verticality and our normal way of moving in space that I think is very neurologically patterned, and it relates to the balance structure within the inner ear. So we dealt with a lot of vertigo and nausea and a transformation of our physical states even before we got into the harnesses and even before we got into the telematic setup. Yes, when you asked me to revisit questions of weightlessness and gravity, I thought about an accidental artistic experiment that happened in 2007 as part of the Close Encounters dance conference that was coordinated by the University of Dance and Circus in Stockholm. What happened with that is there was a newly opened performance space, the most unusual space you could imagine because it's 30 meters underground. It's an old nuclear reactor hall where the cores of the nuclear reactors were taken to be tested or to be repaired. And it's necessarily that far underground because of the radiation. So what happened then was a dinner. It was actually a dinner party for the conference attendees where we had the opportunity to show some artwork. And at that time, I was very involved with Trajet, the installation, with Gretchen Schiller and Rob Lovell and Pablo Mochkovsky and Scott Wilson. And I happened to have some of the Trajet videos on my computer. Now these videos in Trajet, which was an installation, were projected out onto multiple screens. So what I did in the reactor hall was just project them out very, very large onto the cement wall at the back of the reactor hall while we were having this very macabre, weird dinner. And what was so striking about this video projected onto the back of this reactor hall, which was heavy because it was so far underground and because it had such a toxic history, was this contrast between lightness and weight. So in a sense, it's one of the sisters of gravity, and they were existing in this fabulously creative tension. And the reason why I think this is significant too is that it created a real somatic pull of different somatic body states between the sense of being under pressure underground. And I couldn't be in that reactor hall for very long. I noticed every 15 minutes that I was in it, I felt more and more like I had to get out of it. So there was that pushing down, heavy, like exacerbated gravity, at the same time as the artistic imagery of lifting and flowing upwards. Yet, in order to be able to comment on neuroesthetics and neurophenomenology, I read an article by Anna Munster called Nerves of Data. It's in the Computational Cultures Journal from 2011. And she charts in a very interesting way a neurological turn. And as I read through that article, I found it fascinating to sense that in recent years, there's actually been a shift in fascination, from fascination to wariness about a lot of things neuro. Now, I should say that I have not studied this area at all. In fact, I've been a bit wary of neuro anything, in part because I'm a bit of an old school phenomenologist, and I felt that relying on externalized medical imagery in order to comment upon or better understand bodily states, psychological states, neurological, somatic states, felt like it was a shortcut. And I felt that as a dancer and phenomenologist, I wanted to do the reflective processes myself. This is not to say that I could simulate a functional magnetic MRI, magnetic resonance image, but it is to say that a lot of this imagery is being treated as static, when in fact it is about a series of processes. And I would find it really fascinating to understand what people in the audience at this conference thought about a convergence between neuroaesthetics and soma aesthetics. Now, I should say I don't tend to use either of these terms very much, but I think there's perhaps a membrane between the two of them, where somatics and soma aesthetics is about creating deeper reflective abilities through a combination of perception, of attention, and of alternate sensing. And neuroaesthetics has been very helpful for a lot of artists, as I understand, because it creates a different sort of mapping of connections and of perception. One way or another, what we're dealing with is something to push back against, to question our existing assumptions and expand our artistic or somatic or improvisational practices. And that's why I find both of these areas quite interesting and think they might be able to communicate with one another. In a similar way, I'm exploring the formation of a term called somatic materialism, and this exists as a speculative materialism response. There's a lot of philosophical attention being paid to speculative materialism or speculative realism, which is, in my view, a little bit too much like old school idealism, actually taking the philosophical momentum out of experience and co-relationality with the world and into a much more abstracted cognitive domain. Whereas I feel that somatic materialism is perhaps not constrained overly by our embeddedness in the material world, but still does allow for quite a bit of speculative experimentation and the opening of new ways of thinking and new ways of experiencing the world. And reflecting back on Ghosts and Astronauts, I'll say that thinking again about the devising process and how with a combination of movement principles from Dubois, a musical score by Morton Feldman, and subsequently hours of improvisation, we actually were able to shift our somatic states and to create a different basis of knowledge. In the classic artistic research formulation or academic research formulation, this is a contribution to knowledge. And it was done, I would say, through a lot of phenomenological, physical, and somatic experimentation.